The Galactic Empire broadcast her execution across every screen in the galaxy. They showed the body, the funeral rites, the official declaration of victory. But 3 days later, General LRA Fih walked into a busy spaceport market, ordered a coffee, and smiled at the security cameras. Her dog sat calmly at her feet. The Empire's greatest victory had just become its most terrifying nightmare. They called it the Hall of Conquest. Steel and vanity stood where a cathedral once might have. Every arch and pillar a testament to alien subjugation. Banners hung like skinned trophies, each one a different color, a different species, a different world brought to heel. The air hummed with the low frequency of forced reverence. This was the Empire's theater, and they were staging their greatest performance. A cold cone of light fell from the high ceiling, framing the woman at its center. General LRA Fih stood silent, her hands unbound. She wore the plain fatigues of a Terran officer, faded at the elbows and knees. They had stripped her of rank pins, but not her posture. The Empire's propagandists had positioned her like the prize in a cynical display, the centerpiece of a smug, xenophobic spectacle designed to showcase human fragility. Around her, the crowd shifted and murmured. Delegates from a dozen conquered systems filled the tiered seating, their faces masks of obligation. Laughter echoed, sharp and performative, layered with the contempt of those forced to celebrate another's humiliation. A Zarian diplomat adjusted his ceremonial robes, not bothering to hide his smirk. A Keltian matriarch nodded slowly, satisfied. They were all playing their parts in the Empire's show of strength. On massive view screens flanking the hall, the same 5-second clip played on a loop. The projection showed the general's presumed death, a bright blast, a fall, a still body. It was clean, sanitized, a perfect piece of Imperial theater engineered to shatter wills across the frontier. They wanted every dissident, every resistance cell, every dreaming child to see this and understand. Defiance ends here. But the moment refused to obey the script. It crystallized not around the flickering image of her death, but around the living woman and the animal at her side. Her dog, a large creature with a dense dark coat, sat perfectly calm. It did not growl or fidget. It simply watched. And the general, she was smiling. Not the strained rictus of a prisoner, not the hollow grin of the defeated. It was a quiet, knowing curve of the lips, a private thought made visible. That smile was not surrender. It was something far more dangerous. It was a signal. This was never just an execution. It was the opening move in a different kind of war. One fought not with fleets but with symbols. Not with ammunition but with meaning. The Empire had weaponized her image, broadcast her end to a waiting galaxy, but they had failed utterly to read the defiance in her eyes. They saw a broken leader. They did not see a strategist setting a board. The tableau was complete. A noir stage drenched in artificial light, a crowd of compliant spectators, a villainous narrative playing out above. But the real battle would be one of perception, a conflict over what this moment truly meant. And the first crack in the Empire's certainty, the first flaw in their perfect production, was that silent, unsettling smile. It was a promise. It was a threat. Then the broadcast ended. The screens went dark across the Empire, and the architects of that spectacle expected the natural order of things. They waited for the celebrations to erupt in the plazas of conquered worlds. They anticipated the broken spirit of humanity, the final surrender that would ripple through rebel channels and quiet the last pockets of dissent. A clean victory, a closed file. Instead, a different signal traveled through the Imperial grid. It was not the crackle of jubilation, but a deep, unsettling hum of something gone wrong. A nerve had been struck, not in the outer territories, but deep within the Empire's own machinery, in the well-oiled systems that were supposed to be immune to such things. On Danis IV, a major supply depot servicing 3 sector fleets went completely inert. No mechanical failure was logged. No insurgent attack was detected. The personnel simply stopped. They stood at their posts, looking at their terminals, and did nothing. The same quiet fell over the garrison on Lyra Station. 5,000 troops, armed and armored, fell into a collective, unconscious silence. It was not a strike. It was a paralysis. A void where noise and action should have been. On the capital world itself, the morning after the broadcast, Imperial maintenance crews arrived at the Grand Concourse to find a sight that defied explanation. Overnight, someone had taken down the 4 massive banners celebrating the subjugation of the Cygnian systems. In their place hung a single, roughly stitched Terran flag. It was old, Its colors faded and it fluttered in the artificial breeze with a quiet, stubborn dignity. There were no witnesses. No security alerts had been triggered. It was just there. The Empire's intelligence reports began to filter in from the front lines, and they were uniformly hollow. There were no spoils of war to catalog, no caches of human weapons to seize, no bodies to count and display as trophies. The expected tangible evidence of their victory was absent. In its place was only a profound, humiliated silence, and the lingering impression of a will that had not been broken, but had instead withdrawn into some deeper, unassailable reserve. This void of substance became a vacuum, and into that vacuum rumors poured. They began as whispers in docking bays, muttered theories between shifts in engine rooms. Maybe it was a clone that died. Maybe she had a body double. Maybe she never set foot in that hall at all. The stories grew, feeding on the Empire's own lack of proof, becoming a roaring chorus of doubt that no official communique could silence. And through all these reports, one detail persisted. A stubborn piece of psychic debris that refused to be scrubbed from the Imperial memory. The dog. The four-legged shadow at her feet. It appeared in after-action reports from junior officers who couldn't stop mentioning it. It was in the hushed conversations of soldiers who found the animal's calm more disturbing than any show of aggression. The Empire had tried to erase a general, but they couldn't erase her companion. This creeping uncertainty was a rust that began to eat at the edges of their certainty. Fear. A sensation the Empire was accustomed to administering but not to feeling, began to thread its way through secure comms networks. Questions were asked in tones that were a little too sharp. Orders were given with a new undercurrent of anxiety. Their victory had no substance. It was a ghost, and it was already haunting them. Elsewhere, in a command bunker sealed off from the panic above, one man saw the cracks before they spread wide enough for others to notice. Admiral Threx isolated himself. He dismissed his aides, locked the blast door, and in the blue-lit quiet of his tactical suite, he replayed the execution footage on a loop. The sound was off. He wasn't watching the blast, the fall, the staged finale the Empire was so proud of. His focus never left her face. He was watching her lips. In the seconds before the shot, the camera had caught a slight movement. A lean, a tilt of her head downward. Her mouth shaped words no one had bothered to decode. Threx became obsessed with that moment. He ran enhancement algorithms, slowed the feed to a fractional crawl, and studied the minute contractions of her facial muscles. He wasn't looking for a prayer. He wasn't looking for a final curse against the Empire. He was trying to decode what the general had murmured to her beast in those final silent seconds. His screen froze on a high-resolution close-up. The image was unnervingly clear. The dog's eyes, 2 points of reflected light in the theatrical gloom, did not show fear or confusion. They glowed with a cold, cryptic intelligence. They were fixed on the general, absorbing the command. This was not the look of a loyal pet awaiting a treat or a comforting pat. This was the focused attention of a participant receiving instructions. A cold realization settled in Threx's gut, a weight that had nothing to do with the reinforced walls around him. He began to wonder if the general's smile, the one that had so unsettled the court, was not a gesture of surrender at all. It was a harbinger. A quiet, terrible signal that a plan far beyond mere retaliation was already unfolding in that staged moment of defeat. She wasn't saying goodbye. She was initiating a sequence. While the rest of High Command celebrated, Threx monitored the fleet-wide channels. The reports were fragmentary at first, then more frequent. A garbled transmission from a deep space listening post. A nervous query from a border patrol captain. A civilian sighting from a mining colony on the edge of known space. They all carried the same impossible rumor, rippling through the void like a shockwave. She was not dead. Her presence was being reported, a ghost flickering at the corner of the Empire's vision. Threx knew. He watched the decay of confidence in real time, as the solid ground of their victory turned to mist. This was not a resurgence. It was not a desperate counterattack from a broken resistance. The lack of conventional force was the point. The absence of fleet movements was a message. They had not crushed a rebellion. They had triggered a calculated campaign designed not to win territory, but to redefine the very concept of victory itself. They were not fighting a soldier. They were fighting an idea, and ideas are harder to kill. Then she appeared. Not on a battlefield, not in some hidden command bunker, but in the middle of Arcadia Station's main market concourse. The air hummed with the low thrum of thrusters from docking ships and the layered chatter of 100 different species. The scent of roasted alien nuts and engine coolant hung in the recycled atmosphere. She navigated the dense crowd with an unsettling normalcy, a woman doing her daily shopping. She stopped at a small vendor's stall. Its awning faded from stellar radiation. She asked for a coffee. Black. She waited patiently while the nervous Cathar attendant fumbled with the brewer, his hands trembling as he passed her the steaming cup. She thanked him. She asked about the price of Bolian root spices from a nearby merchant, making polite, mundane conversation. All the while, her dog sat calmly at her feet, a still point in the shifting tide of bodies. It did not pant or sniff the air. It simply watched the crowd with a preternatural calm. Its presence was a fact, not a spectacle. Security feeds captured it all. The images flooded the local net, then the sector-wide channels moving faster than any official denial could be issued. Panic was a palpable current running through the station's comms. The governor, a stern man named Vorlak, was forced to address the growing public hysteria. He stood before a bank of cameras, his face a tight mask of controlled authority, and delivered a line meant to soothe, but which instead cut to the core of the Empire's growing problem. He said, "Appearances are delicate things. Sometimes all it takes is a camera angle and the right music, and the galaxy believes what it wants to." He was trying to dismiss her as a phantom, a trick of the light. But in doing so, he accidentally named her weapon. Her insistence on performing ordinary civility, on the sheer boring act of buying coffee, transformed the abstract terror of her return into a weaponized spectacle. It was a performance the Empire could not replicate. They could produce destruction on a planetary scale. They could stage grand executions in steel halls, but they could not reproduce that specific, chilling calm. A soldier could be brave in the face of death. This was different. This was a woman who acted as if death was a minor inconvenience she had already scheduled around. Fear became a currency, and she spent it with precision. Every sip of coffee was a withdrawal from the Empire's account of authority. Every casual nod to a merchant was an investment in a new kind of dread. The Empire dealt in the economics of obliteration. She was trading in the far more volatile market of belief. Each step she took through that market was deliberate, measured, as though she possessed time itself and had chosen to spend a fraction of it here, effortlessly dismantling their victory simply by existing within it. Their greatest weapon had always been theater. The grand display, the overwhelming show of force, the narrative of invincibility projected across 1,000 worlds. And now that weapon was being turned against them. Their stage had been stolen. The spotlight was on a woman buying coffee and her silent four-legged co-star. The script was no longer theirs to write. They had written her death, and she had simply edited it into a second act. She spoke, and her words were bullets aimed not at ships or soldiers, but at the imperial psyche. A transcript of her brief exchange with Governor Vorlak was leaked. Then it was everywhere. It traveled through the grid on encrypted channels and open civilian nets, read in barracks and palaces and smugglers' holds. It was a short message, but it carried the weight of a tectonic shift. Across the galaxy, the general was explicitly reframing humanity's status. The core of her strategy was laid bare in that conversation. She was systematically dismantling the Empire's foundational myth of human fragility. They had painted her people as prey, emotional, brittle, doomed by their own sentimentality. She accepted their premise, then inverted it. She told the governor, "What do you think a people do when you kill their leaders, burn their homes, and call them fragile? They break." The Empire heard confirmation. They had said it themselves for years. Humanity was weak. It broke under pressure. But her meaning of break was not what the Empire assumed. It wasn't a fracture into helpless pieces. It was a deliberate, strategic shattering. They break your expectations. They break the narrative you have written for them. They break your understanding of how the universe is supposed to work. Her quiet dialogue with the governor wasn't a plea or a negotiation. It was a demonstration. Each calm word was a tool prying loose the bolts of imperial arrogance. She punctured their certainty with a quiet, devastating logic. Resilience, in her formulation, was not a passive quality of endurance. It was an active strategic strength. The silence that had fallen across human space after her execution was not a void of defeat. It was a gathering, a collective holding of breath. a calculated pause. It was the patience of a predator that understands its prey must exhaust itself with noise and movement before the true opportunity presents itself. She reframed their entire conquest as a clumsy, loud affair. The Empire moved fleets. It broadcast victories. It consumed resources and territory with a blustering need for validation. Her strategy positioned that not as strength, but as a profound vulnerability. Patience would outlast their bluster. Silence would drown out their proclamations. The quiet act of waiting, of refusing to engage on their terms, became the ultimate expression of control. The narrative of the war shifted in that moment. Power drained from the Empire's spectacular displays of force and pooled around the substance of her claim. The proof was not in a fleet engagement or a planetary assault. The proof was in the unsettling calm of a woman drinking coffee while an empire unraveled. It was in the unblinking gaze of a dog that should not exist. It was in the whispered rumors that traveled faster than any official denial. The substance was the idea itself, and the idea was now loose, replicating in the minds of every citizen and soldier who had doubted the official story. The weapon was no longer a ship or a bomb. The weapon was a recalibrated truth. The dog's presence was a constant, a primal echo in the sterile imperial world. In a reality of polished decks and humming view screens, of crisp uniforms and predictable protocols, it was an element of pure, untamed instinct. It moved through the Empire's meticulously ordered spaces like a living piece of wilderness, a reminder of a different, older set of rules. Its calm was not a passive state. It was a weapon, and its eyes, which seemed to gather the light and hold it in 2 points of steady, intelligent fire, became a haunting symbol that no propaganda bulletin could erase. The animal's composure had a profound, unnerving effect. It channeled a memory of predation that unsettled even heavily armored adversaries, veterans of 100 pacification campaigns, men and women who had faced down plasma barrages and orbital bombardments without flinching, found themselves unnerved by the simple, silent observation of a four-legged creature. A lieutenant on sentry duty would report a shift in its posture, a low turn of its head, and feel a coldness in his spine that no tactical alert could trigger. It was an ancient fear, bypassing all modern training. The beast was not a pet. That was the first and most critical misjudgment. The Empire's analyst had filed it away as a human sentimental attachment, a psychological weakness to be exploited. They were wrong. It was an ally. Its presence signaled a pact, a deep and forgotten understanding between species that transcended the simple master-servant dynamic the Empire imposed on the worlds it conquered. It was a partnership of equals, and that was a concept their xenophobic hierarchy could not process. Strange rumors began to circulate, moving through the ranks faster than official memos could debunk them. Whispers said the creature was aligned with eldritch power, a being from the old myths that lurked in the dusty corners of galactic history. Some claimed it was not entirely of this dimension, that its true form was something far older and more terrible, and the dog shape was merely a guise it wore to walk among humans. These stories were dismissed as superstitious nonsense by command, but they took root in the fertile soil of the trooper's fear. Its gaze seemed to possess a penetrative quality that defied explanation. Soldiers swore it looked not at them but through them. It saw past the composite plating of their armor, past the oaths they swore to the Emperor, past the lies they told themselves to sleep at night. It seemed to look through time itself, witnessing their past actions and their potential futures with the same unnerving detachment. That gaze became a motif the Empire's censors could not scrub from reports. It was there in every eyewitness account, every grainy security still, a four-legged shadow that haunted the periphery of every incident. This alliance between human and beast represented a durable threat of a kind the Empire had no precedent for. They understood how to break a military alliance through betrayal or superior firepower. They understood how to shatter a political coalition with bribes and blackmail. But this was different. This was a bond that appeared absolute, unbreakable, and founded on something far more substantial than shared interest. It was a unity of purpose that their entire philosophy, built on the division and subjugation of other species, could not comprehend. The general was one half of a formidable equation, brilliant, patient, strategic, but the dog was the other crucial variable. It was the embodiment of the wild card, the element of the unknown, the primal force that her cold intellect could direct. The Empire had spent centuries learning to predict, to calculate, to dominate through logic and overwhelming force. They had solved for every variable they understood. The dog was the second half of an equation they had failed to identify, and therefore could never hope to solve. The dog's presence was a constant, an anomaly the Empire's sterile logic could not process. It was a four-legged ghost in their machine. While the general moved and spoke, the animal was a still, silent anchor in every scene. Its calm was not passive. It was a weapon, a form of psychological warfare the Empire had no defense against. The soldiers and officials who saw it, even in grainy security footage, reported the same detail. The dog's eyes. In high-resolution captures, they didn't reflect light so much as seemed to generate their own. A low internal glow that cut through the gloom of a steel hall or the garish lights of a spaceport market. That gaze unsettled even the most heavily armored adversaries. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was something older. It channeled a primal memory of predation, of being watched from the dark by something that understands you are prey. The beast was clearly not a pet. It was an ally, an equal participant in a pact the Empire's xenophobic doctrines could not account for. It obeyed no collar, responded to no barked command. It moved with the general in a fluid, unspoken synchrony, a partnership that defied imperial categorization. Rumors began to circulate among the lower ranks, whispers that couldn't be stamped out. They said the creature was aligned with eldritch powers from the rimward voids, a being of myth given form. They said its gaze could see through armor plating, through official lies, through the fabric of time itself. It became a motif the Empire's propagandists could not scrub. A four-legged shadow in every report, every debriefing, every nervous account from the field. The creature was impossible to erase from the record, because it was the one piece of evidence that refused to fit their narrative of a broken, solitary human. The alliance between woman and beast represented a unity, a depth of connection and shared purpose that the Empire, built on division and species supremacy, could not comprehend. The dog was the second half of an equation they had failed to solve. They had calculated for human resilience, for guerrilla tactics, for desperate last stands. They had not calculated for this. A partnership that blurred the line between species, that suggested a loyalty deeper than ideology, a patience as old as the stars. The general's strategy was formidable on its own, but the dog's silent, watchful presence multiplied its effect. It was the wild card, the unpredictable variable that turned a calculated risk into an existential threat. They weren't just fighting a human. They were fighting a memory they had tried to exterminate, and the memory had a set of glowing eyes and absolute, unnerving calm. The Empire's leadership remained fixated on the literal physical theater of war. They saw conflict in terms of fleet tonnage, troop deployments, and orbital bombardments. These were the instruments they understood, the primary tools of their power. They prepared for a counterattack they could see coming, a rebellion they could crush with familiar, overwhelming force. But LRA's real weapon was something far more subtle and far more durable. It was the protracted, meticulous cultivation of belief. Her campaign was not a blitzkrieg. It was a slow injection of doubt into the Imperial bloodstream. While they watched the stars for enemy ships, she was targeting the minds of their citizens, their soldiers, their low-level bureaucrats. The goal was not to defeat their army, but to dismantle their certainty. Government bodies, once bastions of unshakable confidence, began to tremble under a new and unfamiliar sense of dread. It wasn't the sharp fear of an imminent attack. It was a colder, deeper anxiety. It was the dawning sense that humans as a species do not merely survive a crisis. They calculate their response. They adapt to new rules. They bide their time with a patience that can span generations. This was a terrifying thought for an empire built on quick, decisive victories, the dog's impossible gaze, the general's preternatural calm, the repeated demonstrations of her presence. These weren't random events. They coalesced into a recognizable, terrifying doctrine. This new form of warfare treated fear not as a byproduct, but as the primary ammunition. It was a form of propaganda that worked from the inside out, a force that corroded morale and dissolved loyalty without firing a single shot. It was a contagion of the mind. This psychological corrosion worked faster and cut deeper than any bolt or blade ever could. A plasma cannon could destroy a building, but it couldn't make a soldier question his cause. LRA's strategy could. It reframed the entire concept of war. Conflict was not merely fire and metal. It was the slow, inexorable spread of a competing narrative. It was the weaponization of doubt. The Empire found itself fighting a ghost, a story that grew stronger with every attempt to suppress it, and ghosts are notoriously hard to kill. Their greatest weakness, their unshakable certainty in their own superiority and their methods, was the very flaw she was exploiting. She wasn't breaking their walls. She was convincing. How did a dead woman and her pet trigger the collapse of an empire? The answer wasn't found in any tactical briefing or fleet engagement report. It was carried on a current the Empire could not dam or divert. It moved through the whispers they could not control, the quiet exchanges in mess halls and the hushed conversations in docking bays, long after official comms had gone silent. The Empire had mastered the broadcast, the grand declaration, the overwhelming signal. But they had no defense against the murmur. Loyal soldiers, men and women who had sworn oaths on steel and star charts, began to voice the unspeakable. They murmured it over card games, the words barely audible over the shuffle of worn decks. They said the human general might still walk the stars. It started as a question, a nervous joke, a what-if muttered after one too many drinks. But the question lingered. It found fertile ground in the silence their leaders had left behind. It grew. The rumor itself was the virus, a simple replicating idea. Fear was merely the symptom, the body's reaction to the infection. It wasn't the fear of an attack. It was a deeper, colder dread. The dread of having been wrong. The dread of fighting an enemy who did not obey the known rules of engagement, of life and death. This fear did not disable a soldier. It disabled his certainty. Reports began to filter through the command structure, each one more inexplicable than the last. They placed her presence in a market on a remote agricultural moon. A freighter captain swore he saw her walking the corridors of a deep space way station, her dog a shadow at her heel. A sensor technician on a border patrol ship filed a report of a lone life sign reading that matched her profile, flickering in the void for just a second before vanishing. The sightings came from everywhere and nowhere, a pattern with no center. On the bridge, the dog shifted. It did not growl. It let out a single sharp bark. The sound was clear over the open channel, a crisp, percussive counterpoint to her measured tone. That bark and her calm, knowing smile became a chorus of consequence. One sound from the throat of a beast, one expression on the face of a woman. Together they formed a unified front that was more formidable than any fleet. The effect was a ripple, not through space, but through perception. It moved through the hull of every Imperial ship not as a shockwave but as a chill. It passed through every station monitoring the feed, every mind trying to process the sheer scale of her claim. The Empire's most cherished power, its foundational tool of control, was its ability to define reality for its citizens. It told them what was true, what was history, what was possible. It manufactured consensus through overwhelming force and relentless propaganda. That power was collapsing in real time. She was not presenting an alternative fact. She was asserting an alternative reality, one where a woman could walk out of her own execution, where a dog was an ally, where a fleet of 500 ships could be neutralized by an idea. And with every second she sat there unharmed and unchallenged, that reality gained substance. It became more real than the inert weapons and the silent consoles. The Empire's version of events was crumbling because it could not account for her. She was the fact that broke their story. The broadcast stopped. The confessions ceased. The internal cohesion of the Empire, once its greatest strength, fractured under the relentless pressure of fear and a sudden, quiet wave of defections. Command lines went dark as officers simply abandoned their posts, disappearing into the populations they were meant to control. The center could not hold, and into that vacuum she returned to the stage. She did not arrive with a fleet. She walked. The great doors of the Imperial Council chamber, a room designed to intimidate with its scale and its cold, polished stone, slid open without a sound. She stepped inside. Her footsteps were quiet on the vast floor, a stark contrast to the echoing pronouncements that usually filled the space. She stood before the semicircle of raised desks where the ruling council sat, a living symbol of everything they had tried and failed to erase. She wore the same fatigues. The dog was with her, a silent partner in the final act. She did not shout. She did not posture. She looked at the faces of the men and women who had ordered her death, who had built an empire on extinction, and she asserted a blunt, existential claim. Her voice was calm, carrying easily in the stunned silence. One woman, one animal. You cannot undo an empire. The statement was absurd on its surface, a delusion of grandeur, but the context of the preceding weeks, the inert fleet in the nebula, the crumbling morale, gave the words a terrible, lethal weight. They were not a boast. They were an epitaph. Her message was polite, almost conversational in its delivery, but it was lethal in its precision and inevitable in its conclusion. She was not there to negotiate terms of surrender. She was there to deliver a verdict. She systematically reframed the entire war, not as a series of battles they had lost, but as a profound moral and strategic failure born from their own arrogance. They had misunderstood the nature of the conflict from the very beginning. They had prepared for a war of fleets, a contest of material strength and explosive force, but it was never that. It was always a war of ideas, a conflict fought on the terrain of belief, perception, and will. Their doctrine was physical domination. Hers was psychological endurance. They sought to break bodies. She sought to break narratives. They had the power to destroy a world. She had the patience to outlast an ideology. This was the fundamental miscalculation that had doomed them. They were fighting the wrong war with the wrong weapons against an enemy they could not even properly see. As she spoke, the dog sat beside her, its head turning slowly to regard each council member in turn. Its eyes, those 2 points of unsettling light, seemed to glow with a faint internal luminescence that intensified with her quiet certainty. The two of them were a unified front, a partnership that transcended species. This alliance was the threat the Empire's xenophobic hierarchical mind could never truly comprehend, and therefore could never outmaneuver. It was not a military formation to be flanked or a political movement to be co-opted. It was a truth they had refused to see. A truth about loyalty that was stronger than fear, about patience that was more powerful than bluster, about an idea that was more durable than any battleship. They could not fight it because it was not a thing to be fought. It was a fact to be accepted, and one by one, under the weight of her words and the unblinking gaze of the beast, the members of the council began to fracture. Resignations were tendered on silent data slates. One minister stood and walked out without a word. The illusion of unity, the last fragile shield of the Empire, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The war was over. They had just been too arrogant to hear the silence that signified their defeat. The final act sealed a collapse that was social, mimetic, and systemic. It did not arrive with a fleet engagement or a planetary bombardment. It happened quietly, in the places the Empire had considered most secure. Its great halls, lined with mosaics depicting 1,000 victories over alien species, began to show hairline fractures in the polished stone. At first, maintenance crews dismissed them as settling or minor seismic shifts, but the cracks spread, a silent physical echo of the fragmentation occurring within the command structure itself. The very monuments to their invincibility were failing. Leadership, once a monolith of absolute authority, shattered into 1,000 petty factions. Admirals who had weeks earlier served the same emperor now declared themselves regional governors, carving up territory based on the strength of the loyal troops they still commanded. Ministers hoarded intelligence files, using them as bargaining chips in desperate negotiations with their former colleagues. The central comms network, the nervous system of the Empire, went silent as each faction severed its connection, fearing infiltration from the others. They turned on each other with the same ruthless efficiency they had once reserved for their external enemies. The unity was gone, replaced by a chaotic, self-consuming scramble for the pieces. The general had demonstrated a new paradigm of power. She proved that a predator can be patient, its movements measured and deliberate. It can be charming, disarming its prey with a facade of civility, and it can be utterly, ruthlessly decisive, striking not at the body but at the mind. She fought a war of perception and won without deploying a single battle group. Her victory was not written in the fiery destruction of ships, but in the quiet corrosion of certainty. There were no grand explosions to mark the end. No proud warships torn apart by volleys of plasma fire. No last stand on the steps of the Imperial Palace. The silence was the victory. It was the slow, quiet sigh of an idea dying. The idea that dominance could be maintained through fear alone. The idea that some species were inherently superior, The idea that a story could be controlled once it was set loose into the world. That idea exhaled its last breath in council chambers and command centers across the core worlds, and then it was simply gone. The narrative culminated not in a coronation or a treaty signing, but in a departure. Her work was finished. She walked from the fractured council chamber, the dog a silent sentinel at her side. They moved through corridors now lit by emergency lighting, past empty guard posts and abandoned workstations. She did not look back. She had delivered her verdict and witnessed its execution. There was nothing more for her there. The dog was never a pet. It was a vivid, living symbol of two forces the Empire had forgotten: predation and loyalty. Its calm was the patience of a hunter. Its presence was the unbreakable bond of a partnership that transcended species. It was a four-legged reminder that some alliances are forged in something deeper than strategy, something no amount of xenophobic doctrine could explain or break. It embodied the simple, devastating idea that allies can be as formidable as weapons when they share a common purpose. The Empire's forces were bound by command hierarchies and fear of punishment. Their loyalty was conditional, a transaction. The alliance between the general and the dog was absolute. It was a unity of purpose that required no orders, no threats. It was a fact. This shared purpose was a force multiplier more powerful than any fleet. The entire narrative arc argues that humanity's true strength lies not in matching an opponent's brutality. Brute force is a language the Empire was fluent in. Speaking it would have been a concession, a validation of their methods. Their strength lies in a capacity the Empire fatally misread. It is the capacity to smile in the face of absurd power, to endure seemingly endless pressure without breaking in the way expected, to simply outlast a universe that mistook that quiet, stubborn courage for a form of frailty. The victory, in the end, was not found in the physical destruction of an empire. There were no ruined capitals, no smoldering fleet graveyards to claim as trophies. The victory was in the survival of a single powerful idea, the idea that some things cannot be killed, that some stories refuse to end, that a whisper to a dog can be the first move in a war, and the last laugh can belong to the patient. The satisfaction was not in the destruction. It was in the method. The deep, quiet payoff came from watching a monolith of arrogance crumble, not from outside pressure, but from internal decay. The audience sees it now. They grasp the meticulous, patient architecture of the psychological warfare General LRA-5 waged. They understand the terrain was not a star system, but the collective mind of an empire. Every broadcast, every rumor, every chillingly calm public appearance was a calculated move on that board. They understand the true genius of her strategy. She took their greatest perceived victory, her very public execution, and transformed it. A defeat became her most powerful weapon. It was the perfect disguise, the ultimate feint. Her death was the trigger for a campaign that unfolded in the space they had left empty, a void they mistook for peace. It was a remorseless repurposing of their own moment of triumph into the first domino in their collapse. They recognized a different kind of resilience in humanity's response. It was not the stubborn, brute force resistance the Empire was primed to crush. It was the resilience of intellect. It was the quiet application of strategic patience, a quality the fast-moving, loud Empire had dismissed as a weakness. Humanity's strength was not in its ability to hit back harder, but in its capacity to wait, to analyze, and to strike at the one pressure point that mattered, the enemy's unquestioning belief in its own narrative. The Empire did not fall to 1,000 cuts from a blade. It fell to 1,000 tiny, whispering doubts. Each unanswered question, each inexplicable sighting, each nervous glance between soldiers was a microfracture in the foundation. These doubts were not injuries. They were infections. They multiplied in the dark, silent spaces the Empire's bluster could not reach, until the structural integrity of its certainty was gone. The general performed the most precise act of tactical jujitsu imaginable. She turned their own immense propaganda machine against itself. They had built a system designed to broadcast a single unchallengeable truth. She used that system's vast reach to disseminate a single unchallengeable question. Their networks, their screens, their channels became the delivery system for the very virus that would kill them. They were defeated by their own amplifier. She proved an ancient axiom on a galactic scale. The most powerful army, the grandest fleet, the most advanced weaponry, none of it can ultimately defeat a story that simply refuses to die. Armies need supply lines. Stories need only a breath to carry them. Fleets need coordinates. Stories travel everywhere at once. A story that takes root in the imagination becomes a ghost, and you cannot shoot a ghost. You can only wait for it to fade, and this one was only growing stronger. The new galactic order that emerged from the ashes was not born from a treaty or a surrender document. It was born from the qualities that had won the war. It was forged in patience, the willingness to outlast the enemy's attention span. It was tempered in cunning, the understanding that the mind is the ultimate battlefield. It was hardened in quiet strength, the power of a resolve that does not need to announce itself with explosions. This was the new currency of power. It was a lesson for the ages, but it was not written in the fiery script of orbital bombardments or the grand proclamations of victors. It was written in the negative space, in the silent spaces between the Empire's proud words, in the pause between the order to fire and the weapon's refusal, in the quiet moments when a soldier, alone with his thoughts, first truly wondered. The lesson was in what was not said, not done, not destroyed, the whole sprawling epic, the fall of an interstellar power, the shift in the galaxy's balance, ultimately distilled down to its core components. A woman who understood that truth is a weapon, a dog that was the embodiment of an unbreakable alliance, and a simple, profound truth that the Empire, in all its might and majesty, was too blind, too arrogant, and too loud to ever see coming. They were looking for an enemy to fight. She gave them a reflection to fear. Extinction is not always fire and falling towers. Sometimes it is the profound quiet that settles after a story reaches its final line. The Empire, in its final moments, learned this brutal logistics of memory. They understood too late that to truly kill a legend, you must first sterilize the recollection of it from every mind. You must erase the echo. And they found, to their ultimate cost, that some memories are forged from a material more durable than adamantium. They are bulletproof. So the question remains, hanging in the silent space they left behind, what will you remember? Each one was a stone dropped into the still pond of imperial order. The ripples spread silently through the void, crossing sector lines, reaching stations and ships that had once felt secure behind layers of armor and authority. A soldier on one world would hear a story from a supply clerk, and by the next shift his entire squad would know. The story was its own form of travel, faster than light, ignoring all quarantine protocols. The Empire's own vast communications network, a marvel of control built to streamline orders and crush dissent, became an unwitting conduit for this new form of dread. The very channels meant to bind the Empire together now carried the toxin that was pulling it apart. A security officer on a capital world would access a routine data stream and find a grainy image attached, passed along through a dozen encrypted relays. The general sipping from a mug, the dog watching. They tried to stamp it out, of course. Commissars issued denials. Officers gave stern lectures on discipline and the dangers of rumor. But you cannot kill a story that everyone, on some level, wants to believe. The story of her survival was more compelling than the Empire's facts. It offered mystery where they offered a hollow victory. It offered a flicker of defiance where they offered only subjugation. The general was not just alive in these stories. She was everywhere and nowhere at once, a simultaneous presence that defied physics and logic. She was on a fringe world and a core system at the same time. She was in the past, walking out of an execution, and in the present, buying fruit at a stall. This impossibility was her strength. It made her untargetable. She ceased to be a military leader and became a phenomenon. She became a legend. And legends have a particular property that makes them uniquely suited for this kind of war. They are not made of flesh and blood. They are not vulnerable to plasma fire or orbital bombardment. You cannot decrypt their communications because they travel on breath and thought. You cannot defeat them in battle because they exist beyond the battlefield. Legends are, for all intents and purposes, bulletproof. The Empire had killed a woman. It had created something infinitely more dangerous. The Empire had to respond. Pride demanded it. The whispers, the market sighting, the erosion of certainty, it all required a final, overwhelming answer. A statement so loud and so destructive it would silence the doubters, shatter the legend, and prove their power was still absolute. They would not chase ghosts. They would obliterate the space the ghost was rumored to inhabit. A grand armada received the mobilization order. 500 ships, not a patrol fleet, not a sector defense force. This was their finest war machinery. The sharp end of the imperial spear. Dreadnoughts with hulls that could eclipse small moons. Cruisers lined with plasma batteries capable of glassing a continent. Swift, lethal destroyers forming screening patterns around the heavier vessels. They moved as one. a constellation of cold, directed fury, their navigation computers plotting a single convergent course. Their target was the Rhina Nebula, a vast cloud of ionized gas and cosmic dust on the fringe of contested space. The location itself was a message. They would crush this insurrection in the dark, far from any public eye. Their intelligence, a carefully crafted stream of data, fed to them from what they believed was a reliable asset, pointed to a specific location within the nebula's shimmering folds. It was not a military outpost. Their scouts identified a small flotilla of vessels, their signatures reading as civilian grade, their formation loose and unprofessional. The assessment from high command was swift and arrogant. A refugee convoy, a band of desperate humans, likely a smuggling operation ferrying dissidents or stolen tech. It was a target that suited their needs perfectly. Vulnerable, isolated, worthy of a spectacular, disproportionate annihilation. It was bait, of course, a lure set with exquisite precision, and with the blind confidence of a predator that has never known a trap. The Empire took it whole. The Armada dropped out of superluminal travel at the nebula's edge, their sudden arrival sending ripples through the colorful stellar gases. 500 ships arrayed for battle, weapons systems cycling to active status, target locks scanning the void. They expected to see the panicked scatter of unarmed transports. They expected to see the pathetic attempt of a few outdated gunships to form a defensive line. Instead, a single vessel drifted into view from behind a tendril of violet-hued gas. It was small, a fraction of the size of the smallest Imperial corvette. Its design was clean, human-built but utterly unremarkable. It looked like a civilian courier ship, something used for running messages between orbitals. It made no aggressive moves. Its shields were at minimal strength. Its weapon ports, if it had any, were closed and dark. It did not try to run. It simply hung in the void, a silent, stark counterpoint to the massive fleet facing it. On its hull, painted in simple white lines against the gray metal, was a single emblem. It was not a Terran flag. It was not a regiment's insignia. It was the profile of a dog sitting calmly, its head held high. The image was clear even on long-range scopes. A quiet, defiant brand. Inside that small ship, on a bridge that was more functional than grand, General LRA-5 sat in a plain, unadorned chair. She wore the same faded fatigues. The dog was at her feet, a familiar, solid presence. There were no shouting officers around her, no frantic activity. The scene was one of absolute unnerving calm. She reached forward and tapped a control on her console. On the main view screen of every Imperial flagship, a feed activated. It showed her face close up. Her expression was neutral, composed. She looked directly into the camera, as if making eye contact with every admiral, every gunner, every soldier in that vast armada. The audio channel crackled to life, clear and undisturbed by static. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was calm, conversational, as if she were greeting guests. There was no trace of fear, no theatrical gravity. Just a simple, chilling salutation. She let the silence hang for a moment, a void they felt compelled to fill with their own confusion. Then she continued, her tone almost polite. "I hear you've been looking for me." A slight, knowing smile touched her lips, the same one from the Hall of Conquest. It was not a smile of triumph, but of acknowledgement. She had expected them. "Here I am." She paused again, letting the sheer, impossible reality of her presence settle over the fleet. She had not just appeared. She had been waiting. The final two words were not a question, but an invitation to a game whose rules she had already written. "Shall we talk?" The entire dynamic of the confrontation inverted in that moment. This was not an ambush. It was not a battle about to begin. It was a meeting. She had reframed their grand, violent spectacle as a controlled, almost ceremonial encounter. They had brought 500 ships to deliver annihilation. She had brought one ship and a question, and her terms were already dictating the field. The choice was no longer whether to destroy her, but whether to accept her invitation. The trap was not one of force. It was a trap of protocol. The admiral on the flagship gave the order. His voice was crisp over the fleet-wide channel, the tone of a man performing a routine if grand function. The command was simple. A single word. Fire. On 500 bridges, weapons officers responded with drilled precision. Hands moved across consoles, initiating firing sequences for plasma lances, torpedo batteries, mass drivers. Targeting computers, which had already painted the small, insolent ship at the center of the formation, fed final solutions to the weapons. The entire might of the Imperial Armada, a force built to shatter worlds, was focused on a single, stationary target, and nothing happened. The silence was absolute. On the main screens, the human vessel continued to drift untouched. No energy beams lanced out to carve it apart. No projectiles streaked toward its hull. For a long second, the only sound on the Imperial bridges was the hum of life support and the soft chirp of idle consoles. Then the confusion began. Status reports flashed across screens. Systems showed green. Power levels were optimal. The order had been received and acknowledged. Yet the weapons remained silent. Officers ran diagnostic checks, their movements becoming less certain, more frantic. They initiated system reboots, cycling power to the immense firing mechanisms. The consoles flickered, came back online. They faltered again. The same result, a cold, hard refusal from the machines. The Admiral's face, visible on a dozen secondary monitors, flushed with a mixture of fury and dawning disbelief. He snapped another order, his voice losing its practiced calm. Manual override. Bypass the primary fire control. Technicians scrambled to physical control panels, yanking safety covers, gripping manual firing levers. They pulled. The levers moved a fraction, then met a solid, unyielding resistance. It felt like trying to move a mountain. The machines would not obey. A postponed extinction began to reveal itself in that void. The Armada was not facing a shield or a countermeasure. It was facing an absence. The will to act had been surgically removed from the equation. This was not a failure of engineering, a glitch in a circuit or a corrupted line of code. It was a failure of will that had seeped from the crew into the very metal around them. The Empire's weapons were not mere tools. They were an extension of its certainty, its unshakable belief in its right to destroy. That certainty was gone, eroded by weeks of whispers, rumors, and the chilling sight of a woman who refused to stay dead. The fear that had infected the soldiers and the citizens had now, somehow, infected the machine itself. The fleet's neural network, designed for flawless obedience, had absorbed the pervasive dread and interpreted the firing command not as an order, but as an existential error. On the bridge of the small human ship, the general watched. The main viewer showed the sprawling Imperial fleet, a forest of dormant weapons. Her expression was one of calm observation. There was no smile of triumph, no glee at the enemy's impotence. She simply watched, as a scientist might observe a confirmed hypothesis. The chaos unfolding on 500 Imperial bridges was a stark, silent symphony to her. Panicked voices over comms, the frustrated shouts of officers, the low thrum of powered-down weapons. It was all a validation of her strategy. Her trap had never been one of destruction. It was not a minefield or an ambushing fleet. It was a perfect, calculated inversion of fear. She had taken the Empire's own defining emotion, the terror they had used as a cudgel against the galaxy, and she had turned it back on them. She had weaponized their own psychological state and used it to disable their greatest strength. They had brought a hammer designed to smash a nation, and she had convinced the hammer it was striking its own hand. She turned the Empire's own power not against its ships but against its mind. The fleet was not defeated. It was neutered by its own crumbling conviction, a prisoner of the legend it had itself created. She spoke to them again, her voice a calm, clean signal across the cluttered Imperial comms. There was no distortion, no hint of strain. It was the voice of someone stating a simple, undeniable fact. "I didn't need to kill all of you," she said. The words landed in the silence of 500 bridges. Each one a weight dropped into still water. She let the implication hang there for a 3 count, allowing the image to form in the minds of every admiral and gunner. The sheer, unimaginable effort of it, the energy required to actually destroy an armada of that scale, the colossal waste. Then she delivered the next line, the one that would unravel the last of their understanding. "I only needed to let you live." The concept hung in the void between the ships, a philosophical bullet the Empire's militaristic mind could not dodge and could not grasp. Their entire doctrine was built on a binary: victory through annihilation or defeat. Survival was for the victors. Mercy was a footnote in their manuals, a transient state before the final blow was administered. It was, in their calculus, a synonym for weakness, a flawed sentimental pause. What she described was not that. It was something else entirely. A strategic choice, a deliberate application of a calculated outcome. This form of mercy was not a reprieve. It was a sentence. It forced them to live, to return to their homes and their stations, to sit in their quarters and stare at the ceiling in the dark. It forced them to carry the memory of this moment, this perfect, humiliating impotence for the rest of their lives. They would have to explain it to their superiors, to their subordinates, to themselves. They would have to live with the knowledge that their greatest weapon was their own fear, and she had used it to disable them without firing a shot. A clean death would have been a kindness. This was something else. Fear breeds faster than corpses, she stated. The sentence was a keystone, locking the entire arch of her strategy into place. It was a pivot that redefined the economy of conflict. The Empire dealt in the currency of tangible loss. Ships destroyed, bodies counted, planets pacified. Their accounting was a ledger of the dead. She presented a new metric. Fear was a resource that replicated on its own, that seeped into systems and corrupted them from within. A corpse was an endpoint. Fear was a genesis. Humanity's advantage in her formulation lay not in its ability to inflict damage, but in what it could make others fear to forget. The legend of the unkillable general, the myth of the glowing-eyed beast, the story of the fleet that was not destroyed but was simply and utterly neutralized. These were not events. They were seeds. They would be told and retold, each telling reinforcing the dread, each version making the Empire's power seem more fragile, more illusory. The patient predator does not consume its prey quickly. It does not engage in a noisy, exhausting struggle. It understands the deeper economy of energy. It lets the prey exhaust itself with its own panic, its own frantic attempts to escape the inevitable. It waits, it conserves its strength. It wins by outlasting the other's capacity for fear. Her courtesy, her calm, her almost polite invitation to talk, these were not the manners of a diplomat. They were the tools of the most patient predator the galaxy had ever seen. Her restraint was not passivity. It was the engine of their defeat, and she had just invited them to watch it turn over. They were not the hunters who had cornered their quarry. They were the quarry, and they had just realized the hunt had been over for a very long time. Her argument crystallized then, scaling up from the tactical to the prophetic. It was no longer a statement about a battle or a fleet. It was a declaration about the nature of existence itself, delivered not with a shout, but with the quiet certainty of a fundamental law. Extinction is not fire and ash, she declared. The words cut through the calm static, a stark refutation of the Empire's entire philosophy of conquest. They had defined victory through obliteration, through the grand, final spectacle of a world burning. She offered a colder, quieter, more final definition. Extinction is the silence after the last laugh dies. The sentence hung in the void, a concept so absolute it seemed to still the motion of the ships. It wasn't about the moment of death. It was about the eternity that follows. The point where not only is the thing gone, but the memory of its joy, its noise, its life is gone too. It is the void where echo itself ceases to exist. It was the most profound threat imaginable, because it targeted not their bodies but their legacy. As she spoke, the interior lights on her small ship flared. It was a subtle shift, a brief intensification of the ambient glow from the consoles and overhead panels. It wasn't a dramatic strobe or a power surge. It was more like the ship itself was breathing, its artificial heart beating in time with her words as if answering a silent summons. The light gleamed off the dog's damp nose, caught the calm intensity in its eyes. The vessel was not just a ship. It was an extension of her will, a participant in the chorus. "We come from memory," she added, 3 words that laid her campaign bare and connected it to something infinitely larger than a military objective. This was the through line, the core around which every action had orbited. The Empire's method was erasure. They burned libraries. They outlawed languages. They rewrote histories to center themselves as the inevitable masters of the galaxy. They tried to silence the last laugh of 1,000 cultures. Her war was not a fight for territory or resources. It was a fight for reality itself, a defense of the right for stories to be told, for mother tongues to be whispered to children, for the memories of the lost to be more than just data points in an imperial archive. She was fighting for the right of things to have happened and to be remembered as they happened, not as the Empire wished they had. This was a conflict on a metaphysical plane the Empire's admirals could not map, and their weapons could not touch. She left behind a galaxy that had tasted a very specific kind of defeat. It was not the defeat of conquest and subjugation. It was the defeat of an outdated way of thinking. But with that defeat came a new memory, seared into the consciousness of every surviving species. It was the memory of humanity's profound ability to endure seemingly impossible pressure, to outlast arrogance with quiet resolve, to weaponize not just technology but hope itself, turning the expectation of their extinction into the engine of their victory. The last image many had of her was a silhouette against a bright doorway leading out to a landing bay. The sharp lines of her shoulders, the familiar set of her head, the solid, compact shape of the dog, its outline unmistakable. Then she stepped through and the light consumed them both. The doorway sealed. Behind her, the Empire, what was left of it, fell into a darkness of its own making. Not the darkness of night, but the darkness of a story that had reached its end. The screens went black. The transmission ceased. The last laugh, the arrogant chuckle of the conqueror, had finally died. So what did she whisper to the dog before the execution? For weeks that question haunted Admiral Threx. He dismissed it as a fixation, a symptom of the stress that was crumbling the Empire around him. But in the end, he had to know. In the silence of his sealed bunker, with the echoes of collapse filtering through the comms, he called up the execution footage one last time. He isolated the final seconds the moment before the shot. He ran the highest resolution enhancement his system could manage. He was no longer trying to stop what was coming. He just needed to understand how it began. The screen showed the general standing tall under the cold light. Facing the Imperial cameras, she made her last move. She leaned down to her companion. It was not a gesture of fear or a search for comfort. It was a deliberate bend at the waist, a closing of the space between commander and asset. Her lips moved. The Empire's audio technicians had scrubbed the sound, a standard procedure to remove any final curse or declaration they couldn't control. But the movement was clear. The shape of the words was preserved in the minute contractions of her face. She did not form the words of a prayer. There was no plea to any god, no last request for mercy. She did not say goodbye. There was no sentiment in the set of her jaw, no regret in the line of her mouth. This was not an emotional farewell. It was a transaction, a final, quiet transfer of responsibility. She gave an instruction, a single, clean command meant for one listener only. Threx replayed it. He slowed it to a fractional crawl, watching the muscles of her lips and tongue form the sounds. He cross-referenced the movements with a high-density linguistic database. The translation was not a guess. It was a certainty. The words were an activation code, a specific sequence, a string of syllables that held no meaning to anyone else. It was the trigger for the entire campaign. The command that set every subsequent event into motion. He shifted his focus to the dog. The enhanced image was unnervingly sharp. The creature's eyes, those 2 points of light that had unsettled an empire, did not look up at her with animal confusion. They did not show fear at the approaching blast. They fixed on her with a deep, focused intensity. The glow was not a trick of the light or a camera artifact. It was acknowledgement, a silent, intelligent receipt of orders. The beast understood the instruction perfectly. It was a soldier receiving its mission parameters. The plan was in motion before the first shot was ever fired. The execution was not an end. It was the starting pistol. Her death was a necessary piece of stagecraft, a required signal to initiate a sequence that would unfold across weeks and light years. She had walked into that hall knowing the outcome, not as a victim but as a strategist deploying her most valuable asset, the Empire's own arrogance. They were so focused on crafting the spectacle of her end that they never saw her beginning it. The Empire had not killed a general that day. They had performed a function in her strategy. They had provided the catalyst, the grand public death that would make her return not just a military surprise but a metaphysical event. They had taken a capable commander and, through their own brutal theater, promoted her into something far more potent and far more dangerous. They had turned a woman into a ghost and that ghost into a legend. And legends, as they were now learning the hard way, are functionally immortal. The whisper was the spark. The Empire provided the fuel. The story's through line reveals a hard truth about conflict that goes far beyond laser fire and star cruisers. It presents a philosophy of war stripped back to its psychological core. The battlefield isn't always a place. Sometimes it's the space between what is true and what is believed. Theater is a weapon. The Empire understood this. They built halls for conquest and staged grand executions. They used spectacle to project an image of invincibility, to break spirits before a single shot was fired. But a weapon can be picked up by either side. LRA took their tool and turned it back on them. She demonstrated that a performance only has power if the audience accepts its reality. She became a better director. Fear is a tool. The Empire wielded it like a bludgeon, a crude instrument for compliance. They thought its only function was to terrify people into submission. LRA understood its more subtle applications. She refined it. She used fear not to paralyze but to provoke thought, to create doubt, to make soldiers question their orders and citizens question their leaders. She turned a blunt force into a precision instrument, a scalpel that dissected imperial certainty. Memory is an enduring fortress. The Empire's strategy was built on erasure. Obliterate the past, control the present, own the future. They burned libraries and outlawed languages, trying to silence the last laugh of conquered cultures. LRA's defense was the exact opposite. Her strategy was one of preservation. She fought for the right of stories to be told, for the fallen to be remembered. She proved that a memory once weaponized is a fortress that cannot be bombarded into dust. It is defended in the mind, and minds are harder to conquer than planets. LRA's method was a clinical application of leverage, delay, and demonstration. She did not meet strength with strength. She found the pivot point of her opponent's psychology and applied pressure there. She leveraged their arrogance. She delayed any conventional response, allowing their own fears to multiply in the silence. And then she demonstrated her point, not with a volley of missiles, but with a cup of coffee in a public market. Each action was a calculated move designed to unbalance, not destroy. She showed in precise detail how resilience can metastasize into strategic collapse. The Empire expected resilience to mean a last stand, a defiant charge against impossible odds. They were prepared for that. They were not prepared for resilience to look like patience, for it to look like a quiet smile in an execution chamber, for it to look like a woman refusing to play her assigned role in their drama. This form of endurance was a virus their immune system did not recognize, and it spread unchecked. This transformation happens when an opponent fundamentally underestimates the corrosive power of patient, persuasive, non-lethal pressure. The Empire was armored against fleet actions. It had no defense against a story. It had no protocol for an enemy whose primary weapon was a refusal to be erased. They expected a battle of attrition measured in ship tonnage. They were defeated by a battle of attrition measured in doubt, whispered from one mind to another.